Another major founder, of course, George Washington. Washington exemplified the concept of civic virtue, the idea that public service is something that you're responsible for doing, and you're doing it not for personal benefit, not to satisfy your ego. You're doing it because of love of country. And the height of civic virtue is giving up power. Now, while initially the colonists dug the idea of a king, in the course of the struggle against Britain, they decided that monarchy, after all, was a bad idea, and hence the decision to have a president, a temporary king, right? A king 4 years at a time, and Washington pretty much twice passed up opportunities to be king. Once at the end of the Revolution, Army was really mad because they weren't getting paid, and they're like, Washington, everyone loves you because you've been such a great general. Why don't you just seize power, make yourself king, and get us paid? And he's like, you guys are unclear on the concept. We've been fighting for Republican government. We've been fighting for fighting to step forward in history, not step backward in history. So he scolded them and rejected their offer to foment a military coup and make him king. And then later on, of course, he's elected president. And he serves his first 4-year term, and he runs for re-election. If he had run a third time, he certainly would have won. He could have, gotten reelected until he died. But he was worried that if he did that, then people might get the idea that presidents rule for life. And so he retired on purpose, so that people would have the example that, oh, presidents don't stick around forever. They retire. And then you elect a new president. And that's the way it's supposed to be. And, to us, this sounds like blindingly obvious, but Washington thought that it was an important point that needed to be made, an important example that needed to be set, and indeed, that example was honored. And nobody wanted to, for more than 100 years, nobody dared run for a third term as president, because to do so would suggest that you thought you were greater than Washington. Washington also was annoyed because, having won our independence because we didn't want to pay any taxes to Britain, a lot of Americans assumed they weren't going to have to pay taxes in the United States either. And Washington's like, no, it doesn't work that way. We need an army and a navy, and we need to deliver the mail, and take care of business. And so we're going to need to grow up, and we're going to need to pay our taxes because we borrowed a ton of money to fight this war, and we got to pay those debts, or no one will respect us as a country, and we'll get ultimately attacked by people trying to get their money back. So he actually crushed a rebellion called the Whiskey Rebellion, some tax-dodging farmers in western Pennsylvania. And I will talk about Washington's take on partisanship in a sec. All right, so Washington, having been president for 8 years, is retiring, and in his farewell address, he's like, oh, yeah, political parties are not so good, and we should really not do that anymore. Now, where was he coming from on that? Washington was mad about political parties because he didn't get to do everything he wanted to do as president, right? I mean, like, he gets elected president, he walks down to Congress, he gives them a to-do list, and he says, I need you to pass all these laws exactly this way. And Congress doesn't do it. Congress debates, and they follow some of his ideas, and they go a different way with some other things. And he gets super frustrated. And then people who disagreed with him, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, started a political party to oppose Washington's ideas that they disagreed with. And that really annoyed Washington. Now, he was kind of okay with his right-hand man, Alexander Hamilton, forming another political party to support Washington. Right? Washington was okay with political parties that supported him, but he really didn't like political parties that didn't support him. So we got to take his advice about political parties with a grain of salt, because what he was really saying is, I don't like it when people disagree with me, which is not really a mature position in a republic, in a representative democracy, because there's different kinds of people and they elect different kinds of representatives, and that's how it's supposed to work. And then those different kinds of representatives come together and they have to work it out. They have to form some kind of compromise that works for everybody. So Washington was brilliant and right on so many things, but his rejection of political parties was, well, hypocritical and naive. He also suggested that the United States should avoid what he called entangling alliances. That is, he didn't want the U.S. to make any permanent alliances. He thought it was okay to make a temporary alliance with a different country, to work together with another country temporarily for something you both want right now, but that it was a bad idea to make long-term promises. Now, he came by this conviction honestly, right? Because remember, France saves our bacon. France helps the United States win its independence in the Revolution. And France actually signs a treaty of alliance with the United States. And they're like, look, we're helping you guys out right now. In the future, if France ever needs help, we want you guys to help us. Cool? And the United States said, yeah. And sure enough, when Washington is president, France gets attacked by several of its neighbors, including Britain, and they ask us for help. And Washington doesn't help them. Washington's like, no, man, we've got problems of our own here, and we can't really help you, France. That was probably the right decision for the United States at the time, but he felt bad about breaking a promise, and his solution was, like, from now on, let's not make promises that we might not feel like keeping in the future. And this guidance from Washington is followed for more than a century, right? It's not until really World War I that the United States thinks about permanent alliances, and it's not until during and after World War II that the United States started making permanent alliances. So this was advice that people took, or heeded, I should say, for a good 150 years after Washington. His advice about avoid political parties, nobody listened to. Political parties, continued nonstop because, really, political parties are essential to the functioning of a democracy. It's like you can't play sports if you don't have teams, and you can't run a government. You can't, compete in elections if there aren't like teams, and that's all political parties are teams that represent different folks. We'll talk more about political parties later. We'll go deeper than that, but that's good enough for now. All right, so Washington's right-hand man, Alexander Hamilton, worked for Washington in the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War, was right there with Washington, one of the most vocal contributors to the Constitutional Convention, and then Washington gives him the most important and challenging assignment during his presidency. He makes Alexander Hamilton Secretary of the Treasury, puts him in charge of figuring out how to get Americans to pay taxes. Hamilton and Washington work very well together, and they're successful, and they get taxes rolling in, and they get the nation's fiscal house in order and a decent army and navy set up. Not bad, Alexander Hamilton. He, of course, gets all kinds of love because there's a hip-hop musical about him these days, and he was a super cool guy with an amazing backstory. This is another tale of someone coming from relatively modest beginnings and making something of himself. Hamilton and Franklin were that way. Washington was born rich and then just got richer. The Washington's fortune, I probably should have mentioned, based largely on slave labor. He thought slavery was probably going to go away. He provided for liberating his slaves in his will, but didn't want to take the financial hit during his lifetime. Anyhow, Alexander Hamilton, really surprising for a guy who, based on amazing intellectual talent, study habits, discipline, managed to break into the circle of wealth. Hamilton didn't really believe in democracy. Hamilton believed that the United States should be an oligarchy, a rule by the few, a rule by. He thought the country should be run by the wealthiest and the most educated and talented. That regular people are kind of dumb, and if you let regular people vote, they're gonna elect dumb people who want to do dumb things. And what our country really needed was hierarchy. It needed voters to understand that they should be electing people who are richer and smarter than they are to make better decisions than they would. That was his idea. He also, the United States was a farming country back then, and Hamilton, thought farming was okay and stuff, but he knew that the reason Britain was the world's leading economic power, the world's leading naval power, the most powerful country in the world, because Britain had already started industrializing. Something called the Industrial Revolution was happening, where the British were making the world's first factories. And Hamilton's like, the United States needs to be great like that too. So we need big cities. We need factories here. And so that's, he wanted the U.S. to grow out of farming and to become an urban industrial power. Now, as you know, the United States eventually did that. It took almost 100 years to complete that transition. But, Hamilton sort of was economically right, and also right in geopolitical terms that, military power is a consequence of economic greatness. And Hamilton, this is really surprising, right? Because Hamilton helps write the Constitution. He didn't love the Constitutional Convention. He actually pouted and quit the Constitutional Convention a couple times, but he came back. But he actually didn't think the Constitution would last long. He especially got pessimistic about the United States when the political party that he founded to support Washington, the Federalist Party, started losing elections. And then at some point, the Federalists were washed up. It was like they were never going to win an election again. And he recognized that, and he thought the opposition party, Jefferson and Madison's Democratic Republican Party, he thought they were fools. They were going to screw up everything, and the Republic was going to fall, and they were going to need a dictator, a Napoleon, to come and save their bacon. And who would they look for? George Washington was already dead by then. Hamilton expected they would look to him, that he would be the Napoleon of the United States, the dictator who puts it all together for us. And it was to maintain his street cred as a potential military dictator that he agreed to a duel in which he lost his life. Because, yeah.